In a symmetrical ripple or symmetrical shape, this is caused by mostly waves. It's not the tide that comes in and out. Tide or changes in tide produce one direction and then on top of that another direction. They don't produce symmetrical shapes. They produce two sets of current ripples. Wave ripples, on the other hand, are formed by the overlying waves. As the wave crashes, that column of water, the entire column of water, is moving. Think of it as a conveyor belt. Gigantic circles that are continuously moving and carving a half arc type of a shape into the sediment below. It's what we call oscillation. O-S-C-I-A or I-L-L-A-T-I-O-N, oscillation. It's oscillatory. These wave ripples are formed mostly in shallow water environments or on the continental shelf during storms even. Not a good way of telling which way the water was flowing, but it does let us know which way is up. The ripples are on the surface, so this way is obviously up. Other types of sedimentary structures include mud cracks. Mud cracks we've all come in contact with. They're polygonal patterns formed by shrinking clay, and so the edges roll up almost like little curly cues in some cases. But this is in clay-rich sediment. Sediment that is periodically wet and periodically dry. As clay is wet, is hydrated, forms this layer of mud, but as it's drying, it cracks and forms these curled vantages. And so there are a myriad of environments that can produce this, wherever there is mud and wherever mud is periodically dry, like a lakeshore, river floodplain, you name it. Even tide, even high tide to low tide, you can create mud cracks. How they're preserved is, well, you take the mud cracks and you bury it in sediment. So we see here the mud cracks, they're not really cracks, they've actually been filled in with other sediment, but the cracks nonetheless are preserved, and we can tell a lot about this ancient environment, this oxidized lacustrine or lake environment here in Glacier Park in Montana. Those are all kind of abiogenic. They don't really require life in order to carve features into the rock. Other types of features can be biogenic, meaning that they are created by organisms as they are living, scurrying, burrowing, and eating and even pooping into the sediment. These types of structures are what we call trace fossils, or biogenic sedimentary structures. Again, they can include trackways, burrows, even trails. As the creature is moving through the sediment, we call that bioturbation. Bioturbation is that extensive burrowing by an organism or organisms. And so any other types of sedimentary structures that might be in that rock are generally destroyed by this plowing through of the sediment from a creature. So bioturbation, not always a good thing. Some of the variety of shapes that can be formed by bioturbation. We have U-shaped burrows, we have vertical burrows. These vertical burrows are called scalithos. These involve a variety of behaviors from creatures. Not one single creature creates one single trace fossil, and not one trace fossil is created by one creature. Many different creatures can create the same trace fossil, and one creature could create many different trace fossils. So each one of these traces doesn't really tell us anything about the exact species of the creature that was doing it, but it does tell us about the behavior. What do you think this U-shaped burrow could be used for? Go ahead and pause the video and we'll take a look at it. Okay, well, the U-shaped burrows are mostly for shelter. Mostly there's two ends for a reason. You like to eat out of one, and you like to not eat what comes out of the other end. And so this is a nice shelter for generally annelid worms or any other creature that has that bilateral type of arrangement between anus and mouth. Vertical burrows, these can also be for shelter, but they can also be for predation, where a creature is just coming around, burrowing down methodically, trying to get at something. How these burrows are preserved is by the fact that in each case, these are in relatively soft sediment. So the sediment hasn't been turned into stone yet, hasn't been turned into rock. And so as they're being preserved, or how they're being preserved, is that we can see the burrows here in gray. The creature must have been burrowing into this light tan rock. But why is it that we see the dark gray sediment? Why is that? What happened to it? What happened to those burrows? Well, they must have been filled in after the fact. They were filled in by this dark gray sediment, and then the entire thing was lithified, turned into stone. So again, burrows, soft sediment. We'll talk about something else called borings in lab, or just ask me and I'll tell you about them here in lecture. Alright, with all of these structures, and there's much more, but just as a brief overview, with these structures we can actually help ourselves tell which way is up. We can orient ourselves in the layers of rock, because they can look like this, where the ripples are on the top here, or the entire section of rock can be overturned by tectonic motion. And this is up. Down is actually up. There are many cases where we can actually look at this and see slightly overturned or near vertical features of rock. And the only way that we can tell which way was up is by looking at sedimentary structures. Problem is that no single structure is unique. It's not unique to a specified or specific environment. Current ripples, for example, can be found in stream channels, they can be found in tide channels, and they can be found on the sea floor. That is a variety of environments that you can find these things in. Doesn't really help. So what do we have to do? Well, like always, we have to have a collection of evidence. We have to have a collection of data, a collection of observations, before we can actually make our call on what the environment is. So we have to use an association of groups of sedimentary structures and other sedimentary properties before we can say with certainty that this rock is formed in a lake or a beach, etc., etc. Sometimes when we're able to map out this entire structure or this entire feature, we can use the shape of the feature, or even overall a region where the sedimentary rock is formed. We can actually look and map it out. Sometimes that helps because we can see a larger shape. We know what lakes look like in general. We know what deltas look like in general, beaches, etc., etc. Unfortunately, the same geometry may be found in more than one environment. A beach might not be a beach. Maybe it's a barrier island. A lake might not be a lake, etc., etc. So we have to look at things. An example of this shoestring geometry that we have, this shoestring shape, pardon me, could be a stream channel, or it could be a barrier island. These are discernible things. We can make the difference between them by looking at an association of physical characteristics. Barrier islands versus a stream channel. A stream channel is going to have a different mineralogy. Barrier islands are going to have a different mineralogy. We're going to be able to tell the difference between the two. Same thing with deltas. Deltas can take a variety of shapes depending on what forces are acting on them. We'll talk about deltas specifically later on, but this is a really good example. Even reef geometry. The reefs, like the coral reefs, they can be long and narrow. They can take the shape of a patch, kind of like a splotchy patch of creatures here. Another environment over here, a little patch over there. Reefs can grow along the edges of atolls. Atolls are sunken islands, and so in that case they can take a shape of a circle, half circle, a crescent even. So just because we see a shape doesn't mean that it's a specific type of environment. Fossils. We talked about trace fossils, the burrows, the trackways of creatures, but the actual physical remains are something else. We'll talk about fossils in more detail later in the semester, but just as a precursor here, fossils are the remains or traces of prehistoric organisms. We call that about 10,000 years worth of time. The ability for us to use these fossils in stratigraphy, the layers, the study of the layers, is invaluable. We can make a relative sequence of events, and we can correlate from one rock to the next using fossils very, very well. They're also important because sometimes they make up the entire rock. If we are able to tell what these creatures are, we can make a comparison to modern environments, and we can provide evidence for the past environment from that. We can tell what type of environment these creatures were living in. One of those rocks that fossils are one of the main constituents of is a coquina. Coquina rock is made entirely of shell fragments. So when we find a fossil, we have to ask ourselves a multitude of questions. Again, we have to be responsible and skeptical. We have to ask ourselves, well, did the organisms in question live where they were buried, or were the remains or fossils transported here? Meaning, is this something that's been washed in, or is this something that's actually there? And if so, if that creature is actually living in this environment, what kind of habitat did the organisms originally occupy? What does this tell us about this rock and the environment of the past? Many of you are aware of dinosaurs, dinosaur fossils, but there are other fossils out there. Invertebrate fossils are my specialty, but microfossils are also very, very useful. Mainly around here, we have a lot of limestone and a lot of people that need to know where they are in the section of rock. And so what they use is obviously well cuttings to tell where they are, but also those well cuttings may contain microfossils. And so we can actually look at the succession of microfossils through the rock record and tell exactly where we are within the rock column. Very, very good for age dating and even environmental analysis. These foraminifera here, they can have a clockwise rotation or a counterclockwise rotation depending on the water temperature and the water depth. So you can actually use these fossils and possibly tell ancient bathymetry or water depth from them. Hopping back to trace fossils, much like fossils themselves, we can tell when they have been transported and when they haven't been transported. Think about it. These burrows in the rock and the soft sediment, even if the rock is lithified and turned into true hard rock, if those trace fossils are transported, they're going to be broken. So for the most part, when you see trace fossils, they're not really transported from their original place. They're a remnant of a past environment where you found them. So again, that's a very good thing to look at. You find that trace fossil in your backyard, you know your backyard contained organisms that did that in the past. Alright, well that kind of wraps up sedimentary structures for the most part. Now in lab we're going to go over a lot more, and even in lecture. So please write down your notes, write down questions, ask your questions. Again, I love to have a discussion rather than just talk to you online and here. So hope you enjoyed. I'll look forward to talking at you some more next time. Take care.